going to put my screens up.
Tri-Counties Association of Realtors. I want to welcome you to our first virtual fair housing town hall. I want to thank you for joining us for this important, timely topic of fair housing. And as realtors, we have a responsibility to the public and our clients to treat everyone fairly and honestly. It's important we keep this dialogue going, even if it becomes or could be uncomfortable at times. As realtors, we are the leaders. We set the tone and we set the example. Before we begin, I would like to let everyone know we have a legislative town hall webinar scheduled on Thursday, September 24th at 2:30. Our guest speaker will be Congressman Gil Cisneros. We'll be discussing real estate issues at the national level, such as the GSEs. And for those who don't know, that's the government-sponsored enterprises, such as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and we're going to be talking about their reform. We're going to talk about state and local taxes, better known as SALT, and also fair housing. I would encourage everyone to attend this webinar and get informed on the issues which are important to us as realtors. Again, it's Thursday, September 24th at 2:30. It's free, and you can register at the Tri-Counties website at www.tricorealtors.com. In addition, I'd like to suggest you also take advantage of the postings that provide you with a list of all the statewide ballot measures. Be mindful of Proposition 15, split roll, Prop 19, portable tax for 55 and older, and also those affected in disasters such as our fires right now, and Prop 21, which is rent control again. Be informed and please don't forget to vote. I'd like to start today's event by introducing our esteemed panelists. We have Brandon Butler. He's with us today. Mr. Butler is the Assistant Deputy Director of Education and Outreach for the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, DFEH. Prior to joining DFEH, Brandon was a senior attorney of the Fair Housing Center of the Legal Aid Society of San Diego, where for 9 years he was instrumental in creating the first fair housing services program at LSSD that provides education, outreach, testing, and enforcement of fair housing laws. Brandon has led numerous broad-based fair housing education campaigns, as well as specific campaigns addressing discrimination against persons with mental health disabilities and source of income discrimination. Brandon is a frequent speaker and educator. Brandon was president of the San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing from 2016 to 2019, where he successfully led the effort in creating an annual regional fair housing education conference that elevated the understanding of fair housing issues in San Diego. He began his career as a housing advocate at the Communities Actively Living Independent and Free, a disability rights organization in downtown Los Angeles, where he advocated for housing rights for persons with disabilities. Brandon is a native Californian and graduated cum laude from Thomas Jefferson School of Law and earned a BA, graduating magna cum laude from California State University, Chico. Also joining us today is Brian Green. Mr. Green is the Director of Fair Housing Policy at the National Association of Realtors. Brian is responsible for representing NAR on all fair housing related federal regulatory and legislative matters to ensure the interests of consumers and the real estate industry interests are protected. He also manages NAR's new 45-member Fair Housing Policy Committee, which allows NAR to focus more attention on the public policy issues surrounding fair housing and equal opportunity while better supporting his strategic priority of enhancing housing equality. Before joining NAR, Brian served for 10 years as the highest ranking career official in HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, FHEO. Just love those acronyms, where he oversaw the policy direction and operational management of the 600-person office enforcing the nation's housing anti-discrimination laws. Under Brian's leadership as FHEO General Deputy Assistant Secretary, HUD pursued large-scale, high-profile cases that addressed systemic discrimination and provided widespread relief. Brian also managed HUD's Fair Housing Assistance Program, FHAP, and HUD's Fair Housing Initiatives Program, FHIP, which together provide over 70 million to state and local government agencies and nonprofit organizations fighting discrimination in local communities. Brian held several senior positions at HUD over 3 decades at the agency. Wow, you're that old, Brian? You look so young, including a stint as the Associate Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Affairs in HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research, PD&R, where he worked to reduce regulatory barriers to affordable housing. Brian was a 2007 recipient of the Presidential Rank Award, the highest federal honor bestowed upon federal senior executives for outstanding service. Brian earned his degree in government from Harvard University. Without a doubt, I'm sure that everyone can agree we are fortunate to have these gentlemen as our guest speakers today. Now, as our moderator for our panelists, we have Tri-County's attorney John Giardinelli. Gotta skip that part. Also joining will be Tri-County's EVP Laura Helverson. Laura makes all this happen, and she will be fielding all the questions, and myself, Mary Harmon, your president. So, John, let me turn it over to you and we can start our program.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for participating today. I want to especially thank both Brian and Brandon for giving us their valuable time. What we're going to do today is pretty basic and pretty simple. We're going to cover the topic of discrimination in 2 hours. And we've got questions that we've prepared, and we've had a meeting ahead of time where we've talked about some things we want to bring up, maybe some hypotheticals. We certainly want to talk about some best practices. We're going to start by having Brian tell us what's going on at NAR. Brandon will then pick up and talk about what's going on at the state level relative to discrimination. And then I'm going to just cover some of the legal aspects of what you can expect if this issue comes up in your practice. Then we're going to have a conversation. It's not going to be scripted, so that means that I've got some prepared questions which may or may not get asked depending upon the lull in the conversation. I doubt seriously with the quality of our speakers today that that's going to be a problem. And then I believe, Mary, we're going to open it up for general questioning by the people that are participating. As I recollect, Laura wants us to have the questions put in the Q&A box. She'll then monitor them, and at the appropriate time, we'll start asking questions. So if we have a lot of questions, then we'll probably defer to those questions as opposed to anything that we've pre-prepared. So, Brian, what's going on at NAR? I know that there's some great stuff on the website, but give us a little insight of what you guys are doing at the national level.
Well, thank you, John. It's good to be here. And well, there's a lot going on the national level. You don't even have to look at NAR, just that so many issues are now being discussed openly and throughout the country. Just really, you know, why are we still talking about housing discrimination in 2020? And it appears that you know, many people nationally are educating themselves on these issues. My friend Richard Rothstein wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Color of Law, and he once again is seeing that book soar to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, where it once was, because people are trying to understand, you know, why are our neighborhoods in most of the metropolitan areas in this country still racially segregated. And he's done incredible work in that area, and has made recommendations over the years as to how we can make some progress on those issues. I personally invited Richard to speak at HUD a couple of times, and I think he sounded the warning to us a few times when we were proposing regulations and things that Americans don't know enough about our history in this area, and for that reason, many of our regulatory efforts won't be supported. And I think he's proven to be prescient in that respect, Just this year, the Trump administration decided to roll back a regulation which would give teeth to the Fair Housing Act's affirmatively furthering fair housing provision. This is a 1968 provision of law which called on cities who receive federal funding in the form of community development block grant funds to actually do analysis of the barriers to fair housing in their communities and come up with a plan to address it. It's a 52-year-old requirement. It actually requires that HUD do this in its programs, and in turn, that responsibility HUD has required of communities for many decades. But this new regulation essentially turns its back on that and says, we're good, and if you as a community say you're good and that you're furthering fair housing, you don't have to do more. And the administration supplanted a 2015 rule which asked communities to do quite a lot to evaluate these issues and address these issues. And maybe that requirement in 2015 was burdensome. I think that's debatable. But unfortunately, the baby's been thrown out with the bathwater here, where now there's a final rule implementing a provision of this historic 1968 law, which really does not require cities to do anything. In case you've heard about this rule, you've probably heard that it's targeting suburbs. I just want to say at the outset that it's not about suburbs at all. NAR has commented on this rule to point out that, you know, this is an historic provision that concerns recipients of federal financial assistance. So if you're the city of Milwaukee, if you are the city of Los Angeles, if you are Riverside County, or if you are New York City, this applies to how you address discrimination within your jurisdiction. So it's not about the city of New York addressing what's going on in Long Island. It's what you do in your community. And as someone who grew up, say, in New York, I know within New York we have racial demarcation lines, and it's saying, New York, you need to examine this. Is there anything in city policy that maintains this line? When it comes to your spending of federal funding, are you spending it equally across these demarcation lines? When you're developing transportation policy, are you taking into account the historic segregation? And so folks like Rich Rothstein have helped America understand this was all created, and that it was created by the federal government, that we as realtors abetted it and endorsed it and promoted it. We opposed the passage of the Fair Housing Act to maintain it, and that we need to appreciate that it takes work to undo it, and we can't pretend that it's not there. And so NAR's taken a strong stance that we need as an association to engage on policy and address these issues, because they actually harm us as a country. We leave money on the table when we maintain segregation. Many don't realize that. And so, for example, if you look at hyper-segregated cities like Detroit or hyper-segregated cities like Chicago, there are studies that show that their gross domestic product would be many billions more if they weren't so starkly segregated. Dr. King came up to Chicago in 1966 to advocate for what they called then open housing, which led ultimately to the Fair Housing Act. But he moved up to Chicago in 1966 and lived there for a year, moved into an area called North Lawndale. And he pointed out that we were maintaining separate societies in cities like Chicago. And he described separate economies. He said, essentially, Chicago's got a slum economy, and it's got slum housing, and he also described it as slum jobs, these were his words, in one half of the city, and then the mainstream community. And he said it then, and this is the very area of Chicago that people point to today when they point to Chicago and say, Look at Chicago. Look at all of its crime. He called it, 54 years ago, based on segregation and what we created in Chicago. So you can go through the whole history of places like Chicago and point to all of the violence and firebombing of homes in the 20s, where every few days an African-American home was bombed as people moved into white areas, and understand that we created these conditions, and then we sort of wiped our hands and said, why are they living like that? So we need aggressive policy. That's a major area now that NAR is weighing in on. And we need to also make sure that nothing that we do as realtors contribute to this. We launched in January something we called ACT, ACT exclamation point. And this is an initiative to address the discrimination that unfortunately still occurs in the housing market. I want to put it in proportion because this is something that I talk about a lot and that NAR has made widely known. This is really just a small piece of the puzzle. It's dealing with the housing transaction. And I think the best way to think about it is that we want to make sure that the real estate industry, when it comes to the individual housing transactions, does no harm. That the very least we can do is make sure that we aren't discriminating in day-to-day transactions. That's not going to undo everything that I just described. That's really the first act. And it's the second act with the policy and the regulatory initiatives that I think we all need to lean in more. That's going to make the more dramatic difference. But let me say a little bit about ACT, which I said we announced in January. It has 3 components. ACT is an acronym. It stands for accountability, culture change, and training. And each of those things, if you actually think of it almost as like a triangle, each of those things kind of corral discrimination. So you need accountability, we need some culture change in our industry, we need more innovative training to really sort of stamp out discrimination. If there's any doubt that discrimination still occurs in the industry, we launched this soon after New York Newsday ran an investigation of housing practices, real estate sales practices out on Long Island, where they found that in 12 companies that they tested, 10 of those 12 companies, they said, had agents who were treating African Americans differently 49% of the time, treating Asian Americans differently 19% of the time, and Hispanic Americans differently 39% of the time. And they videotaped it. And so you could see actually how people were treated. If you saw just one instance, if you just saw how an African American was treated, you might think, well, they were treated nice, they were shown homes. It was only when you saw how the same agent responded to a white applicant making a similar request, how they were treated. This was based on testing. This is where you send people posing as housing applicants to see how they're treated. So they're matched, and you can compare how an agent, given the same information, treats 2 different people. So for many, that was shocking. It was eye-opening. Of course, I can tell you that in the work that I did at HUD, we saw this all the time, unfortunately. But that said, they could not have presented, I think, a more compelling investigation or expose of how discrimination occurs. And I think the saddest thing about it all is that the testers, they didn't realize they had faced discrimination until Newsday brought them in the room with their other pair, the person they were paired with. And it was then when they watched the video and how they were treated that they cried. And testers experience injury too, because here you are thinking you're presenting yourself one way to the world and other people are perceiving you a different way and treating you differently. So we came up with this program in part to address what we saw as the outstanding issues. And maybe I'll deal with them in this order and quickly. Training. Many people saw that and said, all right, we got to do more training. And my first thought wasn't that. My first thought was the accountability part. But you know, training is, again, I think, the minimum. And insofar as we've been doing training for decades, we can be more effective in the training that we're doing. And so we came up with a program of training, and this is just, you know, a couple of the high points, to both deal with implicit bias, and to find just other training that's more compelling than classroom training. So on the implicit bias, John mentioned this at the very beginning, we posted to our website an introduction to what implicit bias is and how it operates in real estate. It's a 52-minute video that is really just an overview. You can watch it at home, but we're developing a 3-hour course with the same company that companies can use to train their agents on this. And you know, this is training for those people who really do want to get it right. You know, insofar as discrimination that's occurs unconsciously, where people are saying different things to different people with different backgrounds or steering people and unaware of it, this is helpful. Other training that's helpful is something we're working with Ernst & Young on, which is called simulation. It's sort of like a game, essentially, something you do online where you're presented with different scenarios, and where in one scenario you may be the agent, in another scenario you may be the consumer, and you're presented with different situations, different facts, and you're evaluated on how you respond to those situations. And you get points depending on how effectively you negotiate those situations without breaking the law. So that's a more immersive way of dealing with these issues and sort of being tested on how you meet the challenges. And that's for your own benefit. Those results don't go anywhere. But that would be something that folks can use to get more feedback on how they're addressing real life scenarios. So that's the kind of different training we're providing. On culture change, which I think then is a step above, because you can be trained, but then decide you're not going to embrace it. And many of the folks in that video from Newsday kind of mocked their training. They talked about steering. They knew what steering was, but they said, you know, I'm going to do this. I'm going to help you avoid those neighborhoods. What we want to do is profile some leaders in the fair housing world, in the real estate world, who are espousing and living lives that support fair housing, to show people, to have peers show each other just how you can be effective and comply with the law, if that's the reason people aren't. We don't fully know why people aren't complying with the law, but to hear from peers that this works and you need to be doing this because it's good for your business is helpful. So we've got a film we're producing with some agents from throughout the country of different backgrounds who really embrace this and are doing well promoting fair housing. And then we also are doing some research to better understand why we're still facing these issues. So some pioneering research in that area to better explain what's going on and why some agents still feel compelled to do this. And then finally, accountability. No doubt testing is one of the most effective tools. We've supported the government in doing more testing. We're looking at doing self-testing within the industry. And then we're also talking with state governments, talking with our association executives who are talking with state governments on how they can make state licensing laws more effective so that there is some accountability at the tail end of things. So that is ACT. And like I say, it's just the first act. Second act is what all we can do on regulations and policy. We're doing a lot of that right now, engaging HUD and commenting on proposed rules and the like. Let me leave you with one last point, appraisal discrimination. There's been some high profile stories about appraisal discrimination still occurring. This is where, you know, you own a house, you're Hispanic or African American, you own a house and you're going for a refinance, and your home is appraised less than, say, your neighbor who's white, and they're comparable houses. This is happening. Andre Perry of the Brookings Institution's done a fantastic study on this issue, which is raising attention on this. There's been some testimony before Congress on this issue. And I mentioned this New York Times story. New York Times story involved a biracial couple, an African-American woman and a white man, who, went to have their home appraised for refinancing. They expected it to come somewhere between 350,000 and 550,000. It was appraised at 330,000. The wife had a suspicion. She ordered a new appraisal, and then she decided to remove from the home any sign that an African American lived there, and even removed herself and her son to the mall for the day when the new appraiser came out. The new appraisal came in at 465,000. So a $130,000 difference, a 40% difference. This is what these studies are showing, that the mere presence of African Americans in a home, irrespective even of the neighborhood, but certainly as neighborhoods become increasingly African American, are resulting in appraisers evaluating those homes differently. So this is something we certainly need to address, because if we're pushing for minority home ownership and equal opportunity in housing, the last thing you want is for people to have the opportunity and then fail to realize the equity that they deserve. So we're pushing for that. But what's fascinating about this particular case, and a lot of the cases that I'm seeing, is we have many examples now where families themselves are doing the testing, because we have biracial families, we have people who are engaging their friends of different backgrounds to investigate these matters, and are helping illustrate themselves and helping advocate for themselves what their fair housing rights are and ought to be. And so there's a silver lining in all that we're talking about, that people are getting wise and stepping up and advocating for their rights. But that should also be a cautionary tale for everyone in the industry, that they appreciate that people are alert, people are united, and we're going to address these issues. So I'm happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. That was fantastic. I in preparing for this program, I looked at that video that you referenced, and it's fantastic. I would urge that anyone that's listening today go onto the NAR site and take a look at that video, because again, a lot of people don't think they have prejudices or biases or whatever the term of art is, until you watch a video like that and you realize that some of the stuff that we're doing are based on the generation we're in, the family history, all of those kinds of factors, and even from friendships, the things that we grew up with and the cultural kinds of influences that we have. So I would urge that, along with all the other great stuff that's at the NAR site, but pay particular attention to that particular video. I just thought, for me, as I continue my journey, I really found it to be incredibly helpful, and frankly opened my eyes to some things frankly would have rather kept my eyes closed about in terms of my own self. And so I just thought it was fantastic. Now I'm going to be turning it over to a good friend and somebody that I've worked with a couple of times already, and just absolutely brilliant young man. And Brandon Butler, you're going to talk to us about what the state of California doing relative to these issues. And again, I want to make it clear that although we're certainly emphasizing race discrimination today, we're talking about discrimination in all forms. But again, I just want to make that clear, that discrimination is discrimination. And Brandon, I know you have some great comments on how to recognize that kind of discrimination and what the state's doing about it. So it's all yours.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Tri-Counties Real Estate Association. And thank you, Brian. It's certainly an honor to listen to you and be a part of this. You've done so much for fair housing broadly, so wonderful. Look, I mean, I think Brian really kind of framed the discussion very well on the situation that we are here today in 2020 again, which hasn't, really changed in many regards. The issue of racial discrimination has continued. We've measured that. It's gotten more difficult to detect. And I think as we see the protests and kind of advocacy and awakening of racial discrimination and segregation, it always goes back to, kind of our history, as Brian pointed out, that there's not enough awareness to find out kind of how we got here. It wasn't just by happenstance. There just happened to be segregated communities, and that there just happened to be this perpetuation of segregation. As Brian pointed out, and Richard Rothstein has wonderfully pointed out, this is part of our history. This was government sponsored. This is what has created these lines. And now we find ourselves 50 some odd years past the Fair Housing Act, and we're still battling the same fight. And so I think it is a time to redouble the efforts, to have these conversations, to talk about it. I think the work that NAR is doing and CAR is doing on this point are really important for the industry to be providing more resources. So, I want to show it a little bit, just a few kind of observations and a few points to mention. On the state side, we have always been trying to do work in preventing racial discrimination, obviously. If you don't know DFEH, we are the state civil rights agency, and we investigate fair housing complaints for discrimination. But I think one of the challenges is raising awareness for folks to know that even realtors have standing when one of their clients faces discrimination to file these complaints, so we can investigate them. And some of the things that we're doing, I think, in recognition of the ongoing effort is, one is trying to do more outreach with our real estate stakeholders. So we've been trying to provide education on our new fair housing regulations. We've been trying to engage very thoughtfully on the Fair Housing Act to make sure we have that. We're also, for the first time, engaging fair housing experts to conduct testing throughout California, because we need, to have more robust testing throughout the state and provide more resources to the fair housing groups, so we can detect the things like the Newsday report, observed. So we've been engaging in that. We've also have our director's complaint power, right, which is the ability of DFEH to file complaints where we see systemic discrimination, and we've been exercising that jurisdiction more broadly. But also, to just say on a side note, we've also been collaborating more with the Department of Real Estate and engaging more on fair housing issues. And and I think there's going to be some updated information from DRE on fair housing. So we've been trying to engage our other stakeholders who are engaging with realtors, perhaps even more than DFEH, on fair housing and updating exams and providing more fair housing resources to realtors. And I think that we're also going to need enforcement, right? We're going to need folks to enforce the law. And that's where I always point out that realtors are on the front line. I'm sure, as Brian knows, oftentimes many of the complaints we get around sales are from a realtor. Say, hey, my client, ABC happened when we walked in, or our offer wasn't accepted, and comments were made, etc. So oftentimes, the folks who are here today are on the front lines of observing discrimination, and we need you to report and to make these complaints, or else it just goes unheard, and we're not able to find out. And that's what's so, I think, fascinating about the Newsday report, is that we have the evidence. And in California, it's unfortunately not a one-party consent state with regard to fair housing investigations at this time. So cameras and the such, are not, part of the process, which I think does a disservice because it is very difficult to detect. And I think, the Newsday report gives us that. So, that's where we are with the state, and, partnering with our stakeholders to further fair housing. I'd also mention, as Brian pointed out, HUD has rolled back rules around desegregation and affirmatively furthering fair housing. But one thing I will note is that in California, we have a separate law that mandates that we still follow the previous HUD rule around affirmatively furthering fair housing. So in the state of California, that has not changed. And so we still, are pushing that. Again, unfortunate what's happened at the federal level, and that was rolled back, but we still have a state law that has codified those protections. And I think, just to kind of circle back for a second, I'm gonna dare share my screen here, and hopefully not, have Zoom explode here. So let me try to do this here. I want to share a screen here. 1 second. Which I'm not seeing, oddly. One more try here. See every other screen up, but the one I want. Let's see if I can do this. Show all windows. Okay, here we go, here we go. I'm one of those people who keeps like 100 screens open, so I apologize. Here we are. Okay, let me just get it into the mode here. So I just want to highlight a few points. I'm just going to zip through a few points I wanted to mention. You know, again, we are the Civil Rights Agency for California. And I really want to show you a few maps because we were talking about kind of the history of racial discrimination in California and throughout the United States. And I just wanted to kind of focus in there. So forgive me for sliding through. But again, if you don't know, we do enforce the Fair Employment and Housing Act, the government code 12955 area, if you want to know. I'm just skipping through. So one thing I want to start with, Brian was mentioning the kind of the history of the Federal Fair Housing Act. And I wanted to point out that, California has its own unique history with fair housing law. That, in 1959, the Unwritten Civil Rights Act was enacted protecting residents from discrimination in businesses, which included all of housing, right? So this was our first law. And this was before the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968. So this was, something to be, I think proud of. And then in 1963, we had the further enactment of fair housing laws with the Rumford Act. But, and I want to flash here, unfortunately, there was a proposition. And, some folks may remember Proposition 14, which was to repeal the Rumford Act. And in fact, it was Governor Reagan at the time who was using the slogan, "Your home is your castle," with regard to this proposition, saying that, folks should have some power in private housing to dictate who gets to rent to it, regardless of or using race as a factor. And it passed overwhelmingly, 2-1, wasn't even close. And the California's fair housing law was repealed with that proposition. So it's kind of a difficult act. And actually, Dr. King at this time was going through California to actually raise awareness about this. And in fact, I'm in San Diego. This was the last time Dr. King came, and it was to kind of rally this issue around, voting for open housing, for fair housing. And unfortunately, it lost on a 2-1 margin, but they went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and unfortunately it was ruled to be unconstitutional because the state was essentially being involved in discrimination by allowing it, even though it wasn't specifically discriminating. So it was ruled unconstitutional. We get our fair housing laws back. And here's a picture, actually at the Los Angeles Central Library. And I think it's a picture too to remind us of how many allies and folks have been fighting for fair housing. Because if you see from that picture, that large crowd of diverse folks there, they're rallying to keep fair housing laws. And you see, a few folks here on the other side, saying no, and you actually see protect civil liberties, the sign being held says abolish through Rumford, forced housing, as it was seen at the time. And again, it lost by a 2-1 margin, and fair housing laws were repealed briefly. But just, again, our history, when we talk about how did we get here, where did this come from? This wasn't that long ago. This was the 1966, or a few years before 1964, where we were, this was the position on a 2-1 margin in California. And, as Brian pointed out, with Richard Rothstein's book, Raising So Much Awareness, it's really, I think, caused a lot of folks to go back and look at, what about these redlining maps? When we talk about how did we get here? Why are we so segregated? It helps to understand kind of what was happening within this generation, so to speak, around Los Angeles, around the country. Now, I pulled a few maps up from the Mapping Inequality Project, which is available to anyone to go look. These are a few older slides. I have a few newer slides, but I'm showing you Los Angeles here. And I'm going to kind of zoom in here on Watts. That's showing you the Watts area of Los Angeles. And Watts is a historically segregated community. And, here's the actual, description from, and let me take a step back. This map was done by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a kind of quasi-governmental group that came out of the Great Depression to kind of essentially go throughout the United States to essentially appraise the land to find out where investment should be had. And they used a lot of different factors to rate the properties, but one of those factors was race. And you know, they talk about the schools and the land and the topography, but race was always a factor and was commented on whether an area would be red, you know, for hazardous, or whether it would be green for best, or blue, still desirable, or C, declining. So these are those maps that you often hear about, you know, throughout the United States. And so this was, you know, in the 1940s here. Some of the maps vary in year. I'll show you one earlier from 1936. But just pointing out that, what do they have to say about Watts at this time in the late 1930s? It says this area, which is located both in the county and city territory, is known as the Watts District. It contains one of the largest concentration of Negroes in Los Angeles County. This is the language of the map. There are also many Mexicans and Japanese residents, usually occupying garden tracts. It says construction is predominantly substandard, much of it of the shack variety. Maintenance is of poor character. Population improvements are highly heterogeneous. And while slum conditions do not yet prevail, the trend is definitely in that direction. The area is thoroughly blighted and accorded a low red grade. And again, this is a community that is still predominantly segregated in Los Angeles. And again, you know, we wonder, how did we get here? So we look at these maps. You know, another map, another area of Los Angeles is the Boyle Heights area, you know, which has always been a very diverse area of Los Angeles. The Jewish community, the Latinx community, the Black community, the Asian community. And again, this was because of, you know, restricted covenants and intentional discrimination where folks could live. But again, here's what's said about that at the time about Boyle Heights. Because this is a melting pot area and is literally honeycombed with diverse and subversive racial elements. It is seriously doubted whether there's a single block in the area which does not contain detrimental racial elements. And there are very few districts which are not hopelessly heterogeneous in type of improvement and quality of maintenance. And just, you know, I have a few, you know, more of these, but I want to just flash, you know, Palos Verdes, right, an area predominantly white and wealthy and was restricted. And you know, what was said about Palos Verdes, you know, it says essentially that, I'll just read this line, restricts ownership to the Caucasian race in perpetuity, and all providers are strictly enforced. So again, when we look at, you know, that, you know, Black, you know, families have, you know, less wealth than they had before, that, you know, the Black Americans are more segregated than they were in the 1950s. We look at, you know, some of these policies to see how those were perpetuated. And lastly, I'll just, you know, where I'm at in San Diego, just show you a few slides here, because I think, again, it just reinforces that these policies have kept things the same. This is why we saw in the Newsday article, people are being steered to communities, because we have segregated communities. We know where the Black community lives in just about every city in the United States, and the Latinx community, et cetera. So here's a map from 1936 of San Diego. This is the picture of the kind of original map, and it's a little small, but just kind of get the feel. And, you know, again, you see here with some of the areas that are green, you know, again, they were green because, as you see here, no racial concentration, no threat of infiltration, restricted to the Caucasian race. So this was commonplace, as many folks know. And I know in California, we have a law that deals with the ongoing restrictive covenants that still exist in many of the deeds. But just pointing this out, that this is where we are. And then here's an area, you know, next to downtown, which I think you'll also find interesting. This is an area that was declining. And it points out that this area lies along the bay and is a desirable district. However, in this area is located the servants' quarters for the colored population of Coronado. There's considerable building going on at this time, and if it were not for the colored population and a dump at the northeast portion of the area, the same would be classified as a blue area and comparable to B13. It is absolutely desirable, with the exception of the facts that set out above, and it is necessary for an exclusive city to have such an area. So, and I'll just lastly just show, you know, where are we today? When you look at that map, and I was showing you where the red line areas were, you know, when we look at, you know, some of the mapping today, we see that, you know, that dark area on the coast is the wealthy areas. This map is showing wealth. In the light areas in central San Diego area, if you can see my mouse here, this is the area that I was showing you was red, where it's still predominantly people of color are segregated. It is the concentration of poverty. When we overlay where people live, The orange is the Caucasian group of San Diego County. Blue is Hispanic. Green is African American. You see that purple is Asian. You see again the concentration of everyone in the most concentration of poverty by race and is segregated still today in San Diego in many regards. And then with the overlay of wealth and income and race, you see. And then again, just pointing out where our public housing exists. Again, it's basically central and concentrated in the areas that are segregated. So I mean, I just show that map because I think it's just to raise the issue that we have a long way to go. We need everyone's help. It's going to take not only enforcing intentional discrimination, but also thinking about implicit bias and how that plays into how we interact and how we perpetuate those lines of segregation, as we saw in the Newsday article. So, I mean, I think, there's a lot of positive things to be happy about that changes that have been made, but yet at the same time, we haven't made the progress. And, we need to continue to do more. And I think it starts, again, with everyone here and being a part of this and also, doing some of the steps Brian was bringing up, along with, raising complaints and continuing to be really advocates for fair housing. Because we need everyone to kind of lean in on this in order to make the change. So hopefully in the next 50 years, we won't be having the same discussion that we're having now with regard to still segregated communities and still overt racial discrimination. So yeah, more than happy to take questions, and I appreciate being here, and I thank everyone for this discussion today. Because I think it's much needed and important. So thank you.
Thanks, Brian. As always, a great report. What amazes me, Brandon, about that is these were official policies. This wasn't something that was done in somebody's smoky back room. These were things that were approved by the jurisdictions at the time, and today we see many of the absolutely residual and direct impacts of decisions that were made in the 50s. I grew up in Inglewood, and I remember my best friend at the time was his dad was a real estate agent or broker. I'm not sure which at the time. And frankly, at that age, I could care less. But I remember overhearing conversations about how to keep Inglewood white. I was maybe 10 years old at the time and more concerned about baseball and all the other stuff that goes on at that age. But I do, for whatever reason, those conversations stuck in my mind about in terms of, I forget the term, but in terms of blockbusting or something along those lines, because there was a migration clearly happening from Watts towards and into Inglewood, and how they wanted to keep that from happening. My topic is going to be basically the law, and it goes mostly to what Brian was talking about relative to accountability. We clearly have a long history of law, some of it being, I got my degree in history, and so we've studied history has gone from white only, colored areas of living and of even drinking fountains and things of that nature to where we are today. So we have federal laws, we have state laws, we have jurisdictional laws, cities, and so forth. So I'm not going to really go into that today because both Brian and Brandon have covered that. I did want to talk though about your liability if you turn out to be found guilty of some of these things that these guys have been talking about. Number one is, let's talk about the board itself. The National Association of Realtors has a code of ethics. That code of ethics covers discrimination very directly in Article 10, which basically says that if you discriminate either in the services that you provide, which was the Long Island situation, or in your hiring practices internally, and specifies race, creed, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, and the like, you're going to be guilty of a code of ethics violation. And with that will come punishment of a severe nature up to $15,000. We've also seen Article 3. That's the article that says you will cooperate for the benefit of your client with other real estate professionals. And this year's NAR added Standard of Practice 3.7, which says that your discrimination against other realtors is a form of non-cooperation and is an ethical violation. I believe personally, and I've talked to the professional standards people, including at NAR and locally at our local board, I believe that a violation of Standard of Practice 3.7, because it is a duty that you owe to your clients and to your customers, actually a breach of your fiduciary obligation to that client, and can be very, very serious. So you need to look at that as well. The Department of Real Estate in the state of California makes it very, very clear that these types of activities are unlawful, and at the end of the day could cost you a revocation of your license or a suspension. For those of you that are real estate brokers and have a duty to supervise your people, I would point you out to Regulation 2725, and I believe it's subsection F, which specifically requires that you train, going to Brian's discussion on training, that you train on both state and federal discrimination rules and laws. It isn't something that you should do, it is something that you shall do. And if one of your agents is accused of some type of a discrimination claim, and it is clear that you have failed to provide the kind of training that would prevent that kind of activity, you yourself can be brought up on charges before the Department of Real Estate. If you are guilty of an Article 10 violation, it is considered a breach of your public trust duties and will be automatically reported to the Department of Real Estate, who will then investigate whether or not more severe penalties such as a revocation or a suspension of your license will occur. A couple of weeks ago, I was privileged to be on a panel with our new Department of Real Estate Commissioner, and he made it very, very clear in a question that I was able to ask him that one of the chief issues that he is concerned about in light of what's going on in the world that realtors cannot ignore is going to be issues relating to discrimination, race discrimination obviously being one of the primary concerns, but also Americans with disabilities, familial status discrimination, which is often coupled with a race discrimination, ethnicity, those types of things. So again, if you value your license and you want to continue to be a supervisor, you need to train on this stuff. And for those of you that are engaged in whether it be property management or purchase and sales, you guys need to be aware of the things that both Brian and Brandon are talking about. And then, of course, there's our good friends, the plaintiffs' bar. And there are severe civil damage penalties that are available, not just in the area of any actual damages. Going to the example that Brian gave, unfortunately, that was not a hypothetical. I've actually seen appraisal cases of that type. Well, those are real damages. Those are provable damages before a jury in a court of law. I would also point out that if you do these things with any level of intent or gross negligence, that you're susceptible to punitive damages, and those damages are not going to be covered by insurance if you are sued, are not going to be covered by insurance if you have to go before the Department of Real Estate or some other agency. And if at the end of the day, you end up being found guilty and are assessed punitive damages, then you may not bankrupt those damages in any kind of a bankruptcy proceeding, because punitive damages are not considered dischargeable under most circumstances. So again, I don't want to take up any more time because I'm more anxious to hear the questions that we're getting. And I also have some questions of my own that I just prepared that I'd like to hear from the two experts. But what I need you to understand is that as realtors, aside from your moral obligation, is the fact that there are some very real accountability issues here, that if you're found guilty, if you're one of these people in New York, for example, and you're in California, you're going to be held accountable. And you may not be allowed to continue to sell real estate or to property manage because, frankly, you don't belong in the business at that point in time. And so there are severe penalties, including and not limited to the loss of your license. So, gentlemen, Brandon, Brian, we got a lot of law, right? We got a lot of law. There's no question about that. I know, Brandon, you guys just worked on 50 pages of new fair housing regulations that went into effect this year. And we got lots of laws and we've got lots of protected classes. What I want to talk about essentially, and particularly in light of what I read about what happened in New York, is how do you guys think we can approach this from, for want of a better, I struggle with the words that I'm going to use, so help me out here, Mary, help me out here, Laura, if you can, but how do we capture the hearts and minds of people that are wanting to do the right thing, but don't even recognize internally, maybe because of their generation, you know, because of how they were brought up, all of those kinds of different factors. How do we start getting to the hearts and minds of people that want to do the right thing?
Well, I think training is probably a key component, because I think for the most part, I would say, you know, 99.9% of the realtors out there do not deliberately discriminate, because their focus is on, I sell a house, I make money. And so sometimes it happens by accident, not knowing any different. And that's just me speaking. It's like we allow our clients, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, we allow our clients to guide us where they want to live, because there's this fine line of liability. I've had clients that tell me that they want to live in a specific area because that's where all of their, where they identify. That's what, and I guess, you know, they were Arabian, and that's where everybody that was Arabian lived. They had to live there. I could not show them anything outside of that. So according to the DRE, that's not discriminating because we're following their direction. This is what they're telling us to do. Sometimes we act, and I'm speaking for myself, it's like I'm showing a young couple or a single mom, a single woman, and I have a tendency to be somewhat protective, and you know that a particular area might be dangerous, might not be safe. So you don't want to, so you're not, I don't feel like, so you guys can correct me, I don't feel like I'm discriminating. I just want to make sure that my client's safe. Am I exposing myself to liability if I show her in a particular area where I know that there's gangs and nighttime shootings and stuff like? Do you understand what I'm trying to say? That's my question to you. Where does, as a realtor, do we ignore the liability of exposure if we're putting somebody into an area or a neighborhood that we know isn't safe, and the daytime it's okay, on the weekends, you know, the whole neighborhood's lined up with motorcycles because there's a motorcycle group that lives in that area, or because we know that it's a particular barrio where you have issues in the evenings and stuff. So where does our responsibility as looking out for the protection of your client versus wearing that blindfold of not seeing color? Do you understand what I'm trying to express here?
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yes. So I think agents run into trouble when they believe that they have a responsibility to protect the client in that way. I don't know that, you know, depending on the circumstance, it actually would literally violate the law. but I think it can easily slide into that because as an agent, unless you are, carrying around in your head very precise crime data, you're making a judgment about what constitutes a dangerous neighborhood. You may have read about recent crimes, et cetera, and you're making that judgment. And you're making a judgment that that's where the person, or that the person, would feel threatened in that community. That person could be a black belt for all you know. And so I think it's best for agents to advise clients, you can even advise them up front that certain things that they, may require, they're going to have to look up for themselves and make their own judgments because you couldn't judge for them. I mean, I'm living in a neighborhood in Washington, D.C., which I don't really know what the crime rates are, but my wife is constantly sending me texts, in the same house about, crime that's been committed. And it's a very, prosperous neighborhood in many respects, and the home values have greatly appreciated. Many people want to be here. And so there could be an agent who would form a judgment that, based on the appearance of a client, that they wouldn't, and they would lose out on this opportunity of a really bustling neighborhood, which may or may not have high crime relative to other neighborhoods. I don't really know personally. So I think there are ways for agents to sort of preface their comments and preface their service to sort of almost set sort of ground rules. And you can do it in different ways to also reassure the person you're going to be aggressive for them. I think a lot of agents believe that if they don't do this, some other agent will, which I think becomes problematic as well. So, and then I think more generally, the Newsday video I think is just really helpful because I would not say, if I looked at, looking at that 99% of those agents are trying to help. I think they have a prejudice regarding what helping is and how they help different groups. A significant number of them tell whites one thing, tell blacks other things. Many of them had conversations regarding schools, crime, resale with only one half of these pairs. And even you had some who told whites the schools here are no good. You don't want to live in this area. You want to live on the other side of this particular street until you get to this street, then you want to go west. And very, very precise instructions regarding which parts of town or which side of the street even they don't want to live on. And then told African Americans, for example, oh, that neighborhood's beautiful. I love the people there. And so I think there are many, and I think this is something we need to investigate. I think there are many agents who are trying to get to a sale, and sometimes have presumptions that steering will actually facilitate that. I don't know this, and I think there's research that we can and need to do. But several people have said, oh yeah, they just think it's going to be quicker dealing with this Hispanic person to get them over here, and then they can close the deal. Okay,
we have a question from Marisha Morris, and her question is are specifically to Black American discrimination, not all discrimination. It was implicit design towards Black Americans. So my question is, what is CAR and NAR doing to fix policies, change land use, and mortgage lending risk management assessments? And I guess that would be for you, Brandon.
So, go ahead, Brandon. Tell us what NAR and CAR.
Please, Brian.
Oh, I'm sorry, Brian. That's for you. Laura had to step out, so I took over. So
no worries.
I'm so sorry, Brian.
No worries. Marisha asked a similar question earlier, and I tried to answer it. So a lot of the work, unless it's concerning national policy, must be done at the state and local level, and often at the local level. And we have this federated arrangement where we as the national provide resource help to the state and local associations. So if we want to talk about land use, that's all local. And likewise, you know, many of the specific policies. And so we have ideas, recommendations. We are, you know, working with advocacy at the local level on how we weigh in on different issues. But I also said, you know, this is something I want to do more of. I see in my role as the legislative and regulatory policy director on fair housing, this is my responsibility. But I've only been in this role for 10 months. And so I hope to do more of it.
Okay.
Brandon, what's your thoughts on some of the things that Brian said at the state level in terms of you know, the steering and the, you know, the kinds of things that we see realtors do, and what is the state's position on that?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, Brian, you know, kind of eloquently pointed out the situation. I think at the state level, it's not any different, right? I mean, I think what the Newsday article, you know, tells us is that it is pervasive, and we don't see it unless we have, you know, this is, you know, recorded. And so I think, you know, and this goes back again to a history of discrimination, a history of this in our country, which then translates into some of these implicit bias. Where, hey, so-and-so is black, so therefore let's go over here, or I'm going to treat them differently or perceive certain conditions on them based on that, you know, that they must be, you know, not wealthy, you know, or, you know, or getting by, or they must not want to be over here, or they would feel more comfortable over here. I mean, I think that's this other layer, I think, that we uncover in the Newsday article, that yes, there's straight out intentional discrimination. And then I think there's the type of discrimination where it's built on such bias that it has the impact of being discriminatory, that you're not even showing people other properties because it may be even so ingrained in your mind of where someone who's black would want to live. So, I mean, I think it's pervasive, and I think, you know, from the state level, you know, all I can really say is we need to do more study, we need to do more enforcement, we need more resources, and we also need to elevate you know, our work with all the realtor associations to start changing the mindset and talking about this as a new concept, not new concept, but a reinforced concept, as opposed to, you know, only when there's, you know, a protest around racial discrimination. It needs to be part of our understanding that this is, you know, the reality we live in, and now how do we try to make changes so that we can reduce these impacts that we see. And I would also say too that DFEH, will refer any conciliations or cases we enforce to the Department of Real Estate as well. So just to make sure that it is a serious issue. So we're not siloed. These will be referred for a disciplinary over there for any conciliation or enforced case. So
and you know, this is something. If I could just add something, John, to the culture change part of this ACT initiative. And, you know, ACT is, you know, we just created an acronym that, you know, kind of captured it. And it basically means we've got a bunch of initiatives. We're putting a lot of resources around these initiatives. But this culture change part of it is kind of where I feel there's the most interesting play, because you know, if you used the phrase hearts and minds, if we can get people to just do what they ought to do, you know, they don't necessarily need to know the ins and outs of the law and like what the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is, you know, and what Buchanan v. Warley and these other cases are that you learn about in classroom instruction. If they just do the right things, and part of doing the right things is wanting to do the right things as well, and recognizing, you know, bias and avoiding bias. And so I think there's a lot we can do around that. And I mentioned we're doing some research because we don't entirely understand what motivates the discrimination today among some agents. I point out that when New York Newsday did that study, they tested 12 companies responsible for 50% of the sales on Long Island. 10 had findings, which is an alarmingly high number, but 2 didn't. And one of the first things I thought about, I was like, oh, that's interesting. 2 had no findings. They tested them multiple times and they tested multiple agents, but nothing rose to the level of what, you know, Newsday included in their findings. And I said, you know, that's where you want to look, because they're doing well. They're among the top selling realtors on Long Island, or real estate agents on Long Island. And, you know, they are doing something right, that they're not getting caught up in this. And they don't feel the need to do it. They're in the same market, so they're, you know, among peers. And so we need to better understand that. And then conversely, better understand what's going through the minds of the folks who are not spending the time with certain testers, et cetera. And, you know, as Brandon said, I think sometimes it's assumptions. We had a speaker for one of our functions also talk about how, because of lending discrimination, and, you know, other factors going on in lending, there's sometimes a downstream perception to that minority person, even if the agent wants to work with them, they have an implicit assumption, oh, I'm probably going to run into a roadblock later, and so they spend less time. And so that is happening, but we need to unpack it all and understand it, and then use the data, use, you know, the research to help change practices.
Is in light of the fact those 2 offices that you referred to, did anyone try to contact them and determine what their office culture was, their training? How were they able to get to the point where the other 10 organizations were clearly not?
Yeah, believe it or not, my answer is kind of yes and no. For one, that case was such a bombshell up there that everyone's kind of lawyered up and dealing with it and dealing with their client. And I didn't want to, and our association executive up there is quite busy. I did speak to a few people from those companies, and in fact, some of there's at least 1 or 2 people who came out well from that video, who are actually on our Fair Housing Policy Committee, so we're gaining some knowledge. And then also one of the fair housing groups that consulted on the testing had a staff member who worked at one of those that did not come up with any findings. And he shared that, you know, one of those companies, they had a strong culture of fair housing, and the trainings were serious, and they were, you know, they reserved the time to do it and do it right. There was never any grumbling or, you know, dismissiveness regarding it. It was treated very seriously as something very important to the business. So there's still a lot more that I want to dig in and get from those specific companies, but I wanted to wait a moment and not put them on the spot. That said, we are talking to other companies throughout the country.
Okay,
leaders.
the next one is more of a statement that I think that she's looking for you to expand on. This is coming from Linda DiStefano, and she became aware in risk management meeting with Gov. Hutchinson recently that agents should avoid writing letters when presenting offers on behalf of buyers. Also, to discourage sellers from reading letters they receive with offers. Discrimination complaints are happening. So this is something that she's wants, I guess she's looking for you, the 2 of you, to chime in. Or actually, I could include John as well. Sorry, John.
No, that's fine. I'd much rather hear from these 2 guys. They're the experts. But I will tell you from my own personal experience, both in speaking to my own clients and to speaking to the members of the various boards, both Zoom and back in the day where we actually had human contact, that the issue of those letters actually is one of the major topics in terms of how you can avoid discriminatory type comments or context. And it actually came up with the Department of Real Estate's commissioner in terms of, you know, the danger of those letters. So it is really, for whatever reason, a pretty serious issue that Linda has raised. And so I'd like to hear from either of you. And then I want to go back to the whole idea of the New York thing and the training and all that. So I'm going to make myself a little note so I try not to forget, because I do want to circle back. But let's answer Linda's question. Brandon, since it's a state issue, here in California. What do you think about these letters? We've talked about that before.
Well, right. I mean, I think, you know, and just to kind of frame it up, we're talking about, you know, the buyer, you know, giving kind of a letter with a picture of the family behind a white picket fence saying, you know, please let us buy this house. And I think, you know, this is going across the country, you know, so it's certainly a national issue. And while the practice in and of itself, you know, may not be, you know, like intentional discrimination, I mean, I think we all understand that there's a concern here, right? Because now it's not a, you know, essentially where you don't really see the home buyer per se, you know, we're getting a picture, and now are we taking that into account when we're selecting an offer? You know, perhaps the race of the home buyer. And I mean, I would just say it raises a lot of concerns for me, for sure. I don't have the data to say, you know, this or there's been complaints there. But I mean, I'll just tell you from anecdotal experience, it's been raised to me several times. This concern of, you know, it's being looked at. And to that extent, I mean, I do think this is part of that culture shift again, that change of why are we doing this? You know, I mean, okay, you know, you want to, you know, tell a story, but, you know, it seems like in most of these letters, there's always a picture of the family or some identifying information. And so I think it does raise concerns about the culture, about, you know, opening a door to intentional discrimination that wasn't even there before. And so it raises concerns. And I do think, you know, I applaud the real estate associations for looking at this and really, you know, looking at this practice as perhaps it needs to go away as not being helpful for fair housing. And I can't really see any place for it in light of the fact, again, on implicit bias or history of discrimination, that people of color, and particularly Black Americans, you know, are not going to get a benefit generally based on the data we have. And I can't say that, you know, conclusively, but based on the data I have, and I wouldn't be surprised if you could analyze those cases where you would see an impact, a disparate impact on what's happening compared to the buyers. But I do think it's part of the culture shift broadly. But please, Brian.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you said, and you know, it's funny because on one end of the spectrum, we're hearing people who are suggesting that we should try to do more to anonymize the buyers, and like, you know, you've got folks suggesting, is there a way to, you know, take the names off so that, you know, if someone's name is Rodriguez, that it's not known to the buyer, I'm sorry, the seller, what the ethnicity or national origin is of the person or the race. And I would just say, even if it is not illegal on its face, where you could always run into a problem if people are aware that there were buyer's letters and they believe that it influenced the transaction. I think as a seller, you want to be able to document precisely why you chose that person who sent that buyer's letter over someone else, and ideally, it be a financial consideration, and can agents, maybe agents could be liable too. Now, could a buyer? I actually sort of spun out a scenario where a buyer themselves and or the agent might be liable. Imagine a community which is undergoing racial change. Let's say large Hispanic populations moving in, or large African American population is present, and there's suspicion that buyers are letting sellers know, hey, we're not going to be changing the neighborhood. We're just like you, and are sending the pictures in to kind of make that known. So I don't know. It's sort of untested, but I think almost everyone recognizes those waters are murky.
I just had a transaction with a close family member, actually, where I was helping her get through the process. She had 14 offers in 2 days. Obviously, people were bidding yay for her, right? She ended up selling the house based on one of those letters. Now, and I could see where it could have been misconstrued, because the letter, this is a really touchy-feely kind of a person, and the letter that got her to accept what was not the highest price, but what got her to accept the particular offer, well, there were some terms that were real good, but it was, I want to live in this neighborhood because my best friend lives a couple of doors down, and that kind of thing. Now, I could see on its face that looks neutral. It's an idea of moving into a neighborhood where you have a friend. But what if other offers that maybe were at a higher price were African American, and you could see where those kinds of issues could get an agent and or a seller in some hot water simply because of the objectively verifiable facts involved in the transaction. Brandon, you're shaking your head. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think even, kind of policies like that too of, hey, we go with where, if your friend lives here, we're going to sell it to you on that basis. Certainly starts to raise that problem again of, if a community's been historically segregated and selling it to a friend, or, if someone in the community, it's going to have, I mean, I understand that, and that's, maybe benign, but I think the larger picture is that it starts to continue that perpetuation of segregation where people don't get a chance to get in because they didn't know someone down the street, or they didn't have one of these inns. And so, I think, and I think a lot of people come from this way. I mean, it's always scary going into the rental market or the buying market, myself included, because you're concerned about this, right? And that there's a perception of they would be more comfortable with blank group than person of color, biracial family, etc. And so I do think that those things do concern me because we're not really looking at kind of the kind of baseline issues. We're starting to get into levels that could border on discrimination or perpetuating segregation because there are very few Black families that ever lived there because it was restricted covenant. So I'm just saying it's case by case, but in general, those things raise some alarm.
Well,
I have, it's a statement, but I think, Brandon and Brian could chime in and even John chime in on this. This is from Debbie Maggard. I've been a realtor 30 years and show properties according to price range, not anything else. And of course, no matter who the clients are, of course, I want them to be happy with their home and neighborhood. There are two things I always tell them in their due diligence. Drive by at night to see if there are barking dogs next door, how is the neighborhood at night, etc., and to call local PD to see if there is high crime in area because I don't live there, therefore removing liability from me.
Okay.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Gentlemen, you got any comments on that from a potential problem standpoint, or is she doing the right thing?
Well, I mean, again, I think it's fine provided you actually are doing that with everybody and in every community. I think that's where there are challenges. Are you telling people to do that in Beverly Hills? And so I think that's generally good practice. I might even suggest at the outset just having sort of ground rules you share and provide that kind of information in that context so that before you're even out and looking at particular communities, they know that this is on you to do. So so my only caution is just really make sure you're doing that for every neighborhood.
Yeah, Brandon, I know you've told me that same exact thing, that whatever you're doing, do it the same for everybody, regardless of any characteristics they might have. So you want to chime in on that issue?
Brian's exactly right. And again, I just think go back again to, as Brian pointed out, having that kind of moment of clarity at the beginning, I just think is so important because I think what we see in the Newsday article, and I think also just from personal experience, is if we don't have those ground rules, then there's kind of like, coded words and we start to kind of build a relationship where you could just say, give me the real truth. Come on, just tell me what, and that's what you saw in the Newsday piece. Is it getting to that point where the barriers are off, so it turns into this talk. And so I think it is important to kind of set a kind of field up of this is where we're at, we're not going there, because we know that's happening. I think, any realtors here, in personal experience, this is coming up. So yeah, I like that messaging. And again, theoretically, yeah, even if you're applying it to everyone, but again, there's some caution there because then it comes up to the implicit bias. Well, I only mentioned it to, blank people, or I only said it here. I didn't say it in this community. So just, I think as Brian pointed out, make sure it's applied across the board. Yeah.
Well, she said yes, even in Beverly Hills, there are barking dogs and no parking.
Yeah.
One of the things that that question, which was excellent, or the statement, which led to the comment, is this concept of best practices. I know that CAR's come out with, and I don't know if you can see it on the screen. It is well, you can't. It's not very good. My camera is not very good, and I don't know how to put the new one up yet, so we'll figure that out. But they've come up with 7 best practices. One of them being real estate licensees should provide the same professional courtesy in responding to all inquiries, sharing of information, and offers of assistance to all clients and prospects. What other kinds of, and again, I would urge all of the members that are watching this, it's called a quick guides. CAR has a number of those, and it's on the California Association of Realtors website, and these are fair housing laws. The attorneys that draft the forms told me they're also going to be doing a fair housing advisory, which I suspect will have a lot of what's in here, but it's only 1 page, but again, it has some good stuff. Gentlemen, what do you guys see as some other best practices? If I'm a realtor and I'm really trying to do the right thing and stay out of trouble, what would be some of the best practices that you would suggest I look into? Brian, from an NAR perspective, anything? I could read these to them, but I think I'd rather hear from you guys.
Just best practices generally? I mean, I think sort of what I suggested, you know, having some kind of ground rules. I mean, don't call them ground rules. I mean, you gotta be a little friendlier than that. But I think just, you know, setting expectations early on and maybe even addressing in that, you know, the nature of this transaction, that it's a financial transaction, and, you know, why you do what you do. You know, you are licensed to practice real estate, and this means certain subjects you do not discuss. You know, I was talking with another association not far from you all in California, and you know, one of the agents, actually, I think the president of the association, was saying that, you know, she often gets asked questions by people of the same religious faith. She's Jewish, and she was just saying, you know, they say they want to be in a Jewish community, et cetera. So they have this affinity, but she says she's very careful not to go down that road either, you know, because, you know, they may have different assumptions about a Jewish community or what constitutes a Jewish community, and they could be disappointed that, you know, she said the community was Jewish and it's not really Jewish enough, and, you know, and that you should just maybe, you know, help provide people with some context that you're a professional, and as a professional, there are certain, you know, codes you adhere to, and then you can just talk, you know, again, if you feel a need to sell them about, you know, how you're in their corner and you're going to, you know, show them everything and all, you know, that's in their price range, and, you know, throughout neighborhoods, and just demonstrate just how much you're going to advocate for them, but help them understand that there are laws and ethics that you comply with. And, you know, I think for a lot of people that would be reassuring, honestly. And again, I also point out that hopefully in 2020, we're beyond, you know, some of the assumptions, even of who our family makeup is and our friends, that, you know, you can't assume when you're talking to anybody that they want discrimination. But likewise, if they are asking for you to cater to their preferences, I think even there you want to draw the line. And you draw the line too, because you can't necessarily guess what those preferences are, or just what satisfies those preferences.
I think from a risk management perspective, being prepared to run away from a client like that is critically important, because at the end of the day, number one, you're going to be dealing with some very moral shortchanging of yourself, and number two, potentially that client, like all bad clients, are going to get you into a lot of trouble and perpetuate what we're trying to get rid of. While you guys were talking, I was looking at the 7 best practices, and it really boiled down in my mind to 2 things. Number one, treat everybody the same. Everything should be objective. All the information, all the processes, what Brian talked about before, setting those ground. Everything should be across the board. But then there's a secondary issue, which is that there are going to be times when there needs to be, and this is true across the board of all discrimination, some reasonable level of accommodation in some situations. Now, that's the one, because the word reasonable, I asked my judge in law, my professor in law school what reasonable meant, and he said it meant whatever the jury decided it means. But the reality, because it's really a difficult concept to grasp, from that objective standpoint. So really we're talking about treat everybody exactly the same. Have your procedures, policies. I would imagine that's what those two offices did on Long Island. And then everybody simply was treated properly, respectfully, professionally, and courteously. What's your thought on best practices? I'll start with you, Brendan, and then we'll ask Brian as well.
Well, I mean, I think, Brian really clarified, best practices. And I don't know much I could really add except to just say, part of that culture change, DFEH, we're going to be launching a large public service campaign or public service announcement campaign that's going to try to get to some of these issues. Because I think it really is, that culture change, which is then not happening. And then we see it kind of bleed through and people are trying to get realtor services. But I mean, broadly, I think, what Brian's listed and what Carr's talking about are really important steps. And again, I would just add, kind of what I think has happened post, George Floyd, post this, what you've seen from Carr and many of the associations is a kind of reinvigorating fair housing. And I think that's where it needs to be, is not like blow the dust off and revisit it here and there, but it's actually a cornerstone to the work that's happening. And that it needs to be taken seriously, needs to be embraced as part of that culture change, where everyone's been treated the same, with the same information, it's very spelled out. Because I think again we know it, that there's a lot of pressures going on in the home buying world. And I've been there, and I certainly know, neighbors whispering, all these things happening, and I think it's important to have a realtor who's going to push that back, knows the law, is here to really provide that service and help you. You're entrusting them to help you. So I think, all the steps that the associations are putting together are really key, and I think show that people want to move the needle in a different direction.
Brian, comments?
I'm not sure that there's anything more I would say on this. I see some other interesting questions that I'm happy to answer.
Okay, we do have a few more questions. We have a couple questions from Marion Prophet. And John, you can answer this one. She's asking, who is our new real estate commissioner?
His name is McNally, I believe. He came over from another department. He's been in the bureaucracy for some period of time. The sense that I got in the meetings and in the exchange of correspondence that I got with him is that he's very knowledgeable, he's learning fast, he was very flexible. Normally he would have done a PowerPoint presentation, but we had asked him, could we do it more like a news conference, and we were able to get him to answer most of the questions that we wanted to ask, and he was very forthcoming, and he was willing to rely on his staff. So he struck me as somebody who is going to be very, he indicated 3 areas that he was primarily concerned with. One was training, that he felt that training was inadequate across the board, but particularly in the area of discrimination, which was the second area that he expressed concern over. And then the third area that he expressed concern over was just general consumer protection, particularly in the area of real estate agent fraud, where a real estate agent, for example, does not reveal all of the offers they got. So I was very impressed. I thought, while he may not have been my personal first choice, I thought that was not a bad choice, and that he'll be probably okay. That was my opinion. That's
Okay.
my thought about the guy.
Marion's second question is, what are your thoughts about asking for photo ID with lease applications?
I guess I would ask why.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Go ahead, guys.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Go ahead, Brian. No, go ahead, Brian. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would ask why. I don't understand how that would be used, or what you gain from that. I mean, I've seen enough cases you know, in my 30 years at HUD, or near 30 years, I won't prematurely age myself. I've seen enough cases where people coded applications to let you know what race people were in order to discriminate. I guess you got a picture, you don't need those codes. I'm just not sure what the purpose would be. Maybe if after someone has been accepted as a tenant and it's a large apartment building and you want to know, you know, who's in the building so you can recognize them or put a name to a face, maybe that's okay. But I would ask why, just because I think it just creates a potential basis for discrimination. I know, for example, I've stayed off Airbnb precisely because when I heard about it, they want your picture. And I'm like, okay, I know how that's going to go. And maybe I'm cynical, but I know a lot of African Americans who feel the same way about that.
Brandon, anything to add?
Oh, exactly.
Brian?
Brandon?
No, I agree. I'm good. But Brian hit that one perfectly.
I'd like to jump in and throw in some comments. I think the purpose for the ID once the application is accepted is so in the event down the line, if you have to go through an eviction, you have their information that you're going to need if there's a judgment awarded. So I don't think the ID is for the purpose, it's for those purposes and not the other.
Right.
And Marion
I said, I guess, I don't agree that it's good on the lease application. The question is about the lease application. Once a tenant, I think, maybe.
Correct. I think that's what we're talking about, because otherwise, if you're issued a judgment, it's very difficult to get that information from them afterwards. After the judgment is issued, because you know there's no love there anymore. It's all gone.
and Marion is specifying that it's more related to fraud. So I suppose if you after they become a tenant, having
Okay.
getting
Yeah.
the ID.
Okay.
I even saw a gentleman where the use of the name, you know, where there's certain names that are given, I think the term that was used in the seminar was weaponized. And so, which leads me to another question, which is, what are some of the areas where, obviously in showing and the kinds of things that we've been talking about, but what about advertising and social media and just your choice of words and the way you advertise property? Are you guys concerned that there's been some problems in that arena as well?
I mean, it's definitely an issue. I mean, I can't say that at DFEH we've been kind of more focused on advertisements discriminating on the basis of sources of income and criminal history, which have been kind of our focus. But I agree, it is an issue. I mean, there's less of like kind of like in the 30 years ago, the New York Times and models of race, but it's still an important issue. And I think you see it with like new homes being built, are the billboards and things reflective of the community, as it's stating a preference. I mean, we don't see it as much, but I would think it's always good to make people aware of the language. And Brian, I'm sure has a lot more to say from the sales side, but yeah, that's all I could say on that it's an issue, but not as many active cases of that right now.
Okay. Brian,
Yeah, I don't really see it coming up so much anymore, in terms of, words or anything. Certainly with the internet, when like Craigslist became popular, we were seeing issues. I actually went out to San Francisco and sat in Craig's chair, and we went through ads that were popping up on their, on their site. And they actually chose to censor some things. Like there were certain combinations of words that never mean anything good, and even certain slurs and expressions that would never mean anything good. But it gets very hard to police words because context always matters. But I haven't really seen much of an issue of late. The bigger advertising concerns we've had have concerned the actual web platforms and how some of the websites, like for example, Facebook, would allow people to target ads based on race. And so more systemic questions like that. And so we launched a case against Facebook when I was at HUD because you could actually indicate what race of persons you want to see your ad, which was outrageous. And so I think that's the kind of stuff we really are policing more. Fortunately, most people are not putting discriminatory language in their ads.
Laura, questions that are?
Yep, I have another question. And this goes back to the letter discussion that we had earlier. Is there a problem with sending a letter with the offer and no picture or familiar or other fair housing categories are given? Is it okay to say that it's a first-time home buyer or move down buyer, etc.?
Go ahead, Brandon.
I mean, look, it's hard to have like a big broad rule of like what are all the contours of it. I mean, all I would really say is, look, it's opening some doors, and if there ever is a fair housing case, that's going to be a piece of evidence that's going to be looked at. In terms of like mentioning, hey, it's a first-time home buyer, and probably maybe they have an FHA-backed loan, so they're going to find out anyways on that point. I mean, I get it. There's maybe hey, so and so works nearby, or I get these kind of generalized comments, but I can't really give from DFH a position on can it be this or that. I would just kind of raise the issue that these could be used in a way to discriminate, and they're concerned. But I understand the questioner's point about broad, just generalized information. Is that okay? We really love your community. I don't know. I get that, but I can't give a specific rule. But I just raised that there's caution with the letters. But I understand a benign comment of, hey, the weather's great, we want to live there, isn't going to break the bank. But it opens some doors that are hard to essentially to police as much. So there's some risk for sure.
In and of themselves, Laura, there's nothing from a perspective of either the regulatory rules in California or any other specific rule that I'm aware of that says you can't do those letters. The issue isn't with the drafting of a letter. The issue is with the content of that letter and what it may allude to either directly or most likely inferentially. And that's really where you get into trouble. So you're going to have to make sure that the letters that are coming from a buyer to a seller, sometimes through you, are clearly and objectively non-discriminatory. That can be difficult. But the letter itself is not against the law, not that I'm aware of, not yet anyway. So, and then photographs, you got to be careful of photographs too, for the reasons that the gentleman already alluded to. Brian, you had anything to add to that? It just seems to me, just got to be careful if you're going to do a letter, that it be carefully done.
Yeah, and I don't think I have anything to add. Again, I think context matters, right? It's interesting because I think also perspective matters. I never would feel in a process where I have to give a picture, this is going to be a good thing. And maybe you think I'm cynical, but that's just often what we see. And so I still think, when people want these processes, that it's somewhat insensitive to how many populations get, turned away because of those processes. So I think you really have to have a strong justification for why you're giving this information. But yes, it would appear that like saying first-time home buyer is probably benign. I can't think of how that would discriminate, but context matters.
So I shared in the chat the link for the Newsday video article that they have, because I think it's important for everyone to look at that. We don't have any additional questions, so I don't know if you guys have. Okay.
I do. I want to circle back to Marion Prophet's question, where when she was asking if it's okay to ask for ID for when you're taking a lease application. and I guess what she was trying to point out is the issue of fraud, that, you know, we also have a responsibility as property owners, but also to our clients and our investors, that you will sometimes have people presenting themselves to be somebody who they are not. And then once they get into the property, so why would you, think that somebody's discriminating if they're asking for proof of ID that you really are who you say you are, and you're not somebody else, and you would treat that as a form of discrimination? Do you understand? I mean,
yes.
when you do a loan, you have to provide your
clarify.
ID and your social security.
Yes, let me clarify,
Okay.
because I understood the question differently from
Okay.
how you just now presented it. I thought the question was asking for the person to submit a photo with their application, you know, so that, you know, the person who ultimately would consider their application would see their photo. If it is someone submitting a photo ID, say in the rental office, at that moment, for the person to identify that they are who they say they are on the application, that may be fine. My concern isn't checking for fraud and, you know, checking that the person is who they say they are. It's the submission of a photo. So I don't know how that process works that you're describing, whether people are submitting it, you know, via the internet or whatever. If they can, I think it's the photo part. Like, where's the photo matching up? Is that, you know, matching up with the person in front of you, like you would at a bar, or
Yeah.
are they never
Brian,
seeing you and they're just getting a copy of someone's driver's license with their photo,
Well,
and that's the one time they see them?
I think you have to keep in mind that, especially in the economic environment that we're in and we're headed into, that people's sense of survival is going to be, and you're going to find some people doing unscrupulous things. And if you use your credit card, they oftentimes will ask you for an ID to see that they match up. So if somebody's filling out an application to say, I want to rent your house, I want to rent the apartment, all you're doing is applying identification to say that you are the person who's filling out that application. And I think that's just a practice of good business.
That's happening in person. That's happening in person, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to jump in real quick because we're going to run out of time, and I know these gentlemen have other commitments. So what I want to do now is first I'm going to give Brandon, because I know you've got to go somewhere. We've got the new landlord-tenant law here in California, so you probably got to go deal with that.
Yeah, a lot going on there. But I just want to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to the Tri-County Real Estate Association, and to John, to Laura, and Mary. And of course, again, a great pleasure to present with Brian. Again, I appreciate everyone being here today. I mean, this is a great topic, and the fact that you're being here is key to pushing the needle forward to make the change. You know, we got a lot of work to do, so I hope we can continue the conversation. And many thanks to everyone, and I will hopefully see everyone soon. So thank you very much.
Brian,
Bye.
can you just summarize real quickly some of the resource? Okay, I know that personally, when I was just kind of, frankly, not just necessarily for this, but just generally, I went to the NAR site, and I was pleasantly blown away by the quality of the materials that you have on this topic. And you might want to point out, particularly for me personally, the one on implied bias that you referred to, the 52-minute video. I would urge everybody, in addition to the New York video that Laura just shared, to take a look at that video. What other kinds of resources do you anticipate providing to the members so that we can, as Brandon called it, move the needle forward?
So we did provide some guidance during coronavirus on fair housing issues that could arise during the pandemic. We're still in it. But, you know, early on, there was discrimination that we saw against many Chinese Americans and actually other Asian Americans too, who were perceived as Chinese. Then quickly the questions became whether or not coronavirus was a disability, and we provided guidance on how to evaluate those questions. The short answer is, you know, disability or not, people have a right to protect themselves from a lethal contagious virus, but there are things that you can do if, say, someone announces when they call you or contact you that they have coronavirus. There are ways you can arrange to show people properties remotely. I think the mere fact that the real estate industry is doing well during this, people have found a way to negotiate coronavirus and still sell homes. So that's good, and I hope our guidance helped, but that's up there still if it can be of use to people. I mentioned that we're doing other training. We're working with Ernst & Young to do this simulation training where you put yourself in actual scenarios online and you're tested on how you negotiate fair housing issues that arise. We are going to have more films. We are working with a fair housing group and a movie director on a film about fair housing leaders. As I said, the culture change is really important, and the more that we can do to highlight peers who are successful and incorporate fair housing and diversity as an integral part of their business, I think will be really helpful to everybody. So that's a major focus. And so, yeah, just keep your eyes on that spot, and we'll be doing more.
And again, CAR also, from a state level, has a number of things available to you on their website. And of course, Laura continues to link and post those things that might come up on the association's website as well. And again, I want to remind everybody that this isn't something that you should do. This is something that you shall do under California law, under California regulatory law. This is a mandate. But the reality is that we need to deal with this issue. I was shocked. I'm not a realtor, but I frankly have been serving the real estate community for 40 years. And I was embarrassed for my clients when I saw what was going on in New York, because I suspect it's going on in Southern California, maybe differently, but is going on certainly. So I just urge that you get educated on this topic, as Mary pointed out before. Training is one of the three parts of the act. That you report these types of things if you see them. I think Brandon was correct that realtors are on the front lines, and you know, we've been talking about the realtors that are discriminating, but there's a whole bunch of realtors that would like to see this practice end. It's bad for business, it's bad for morality, it's bad for the country as a whole. So, and then of course, you know, hopefully over time, we're patient with ourselves as our culture slowly changes. So, and if there's any other closing comments, Mary, I guess the clock on the wall says we're done.
Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for attending today. We hope you were able to get a few takeaways. And please don't forget to visit our realtor website for your realtor needs. And don't forget to sign up for our legislative town hall meeting with Congressman Gil Cisneros at 2:30 on September the 24th. I'd like to thank Brian Green for being here. Thank you for all the information. It was really insightful, and we really appreciate you being here. John, even though you call me Marty, thank you for being here.
It's okay.
Yes.
Sometimes I call my own children by the wrong name.
Oh God, I do that all the time. And Laura, thank you for everything that you do to make it happen. And so everybody be careful, stay safe, and stay healthy. And God bless.
Thank you.
That's it.
Again,
We're done.
Brian, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your participation today. Take care. Laura, I'll talk to you
Thanks
soon.
for having me.
Okay. Thank you,
Laura, I'll
everyone.
call you back. I'll call you in a minute.
Okay.
Okay?
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.